It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the air in the back of the local food bank hummed with the quiet desperation of a long queue. Inside, among the endless stacks of canned corn and boxes of dry pasta, a glimmer of hope materialized in the hands of a young mother named Maria. Her two children, Matteo and Sofia, their eyes wide with hunger and impatience, clung to the fabric of her worn jeans. A volunteer, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, pushed a large, shallow cardboard box across the metal table. Unlike the usual fare, this box was a treasure trove of color and life: ruby red tomatoes still warm from the sun, crisp lettuce glistening with dew, and a bundle of fat carrots with their earthy tops still attached. Fresh from the community garden, the volunteer said with a tired smile. "Just got it this morning." Maria's face, etched with the stress of making ends meet, softened into a look of profound relief. The vegetables weren't just food. They were a promise of health, of a good meal, of a small victory in a world full of setbacks. She saw her children's excitement, a rare spark of joy as they reached for a handful of plump green beans. This small, crucial moment of happiness was a testament to the powerful work happening just a few streets away, in the heart of a suburban neighborhood where a once overgrown, neglected plot of land had been transformed into a vibrant sanctuary. That sanctuary was Sarah's life's work. A landscape architect who had grown disillusioned with sterile, cookie-cutter designs, she had found her true calling in nurturing life from the soil. The garden, nestled behind the last cul-de-sac before a sprawling woodland, was a patchwork of raised beds, a symphony of herbs and vegetables growing in beautiful, unruly harmony. It was a place where retirees with green thumbs shared secrets with young parents eager to learn, where teenagers learned the value of a hard day's work, and where the air was always thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming basil. The garden was a microcosm of the neighborhood's best qualities: cooperation, kindness, and a shared purpose. Sarah, with her perpetually dirt-stained hands and a sun-faded straw hat, moved among the beds like a benevolent queen, her voice a calm and reassuring presence. She was kneeling by a row of tomatoes, checking for blight, when old Mr. Thompson, his back a permanent question mark from years of manual labor, shuffled over. "Got a good haul today, Sarah," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Filled up 3 more boxes for the food bank," she smiled, her heart swelling with pride. This wasn't just a garden, it was a lifeline. The day proceeded like any other, a peaceful rhythm of weeding, watering, and harvesting. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the neat rows of corn and the plump pumpkins just beginning to turn orange. The laughter of children playing in the central dirt path, a stark and welcome contrast to the manicured lawns of the surrounding houses, filled the air. It was in this moment of idyllic peace that a small, white postal truck rumbled down the street, its tires crunching on the gravel. Sarah didn't think anything of it. It was just the mail. She gathered her tools, said her goodbyes to the last few stragglers, and walked to her mailbox, a simple metal box attached to a wooden post at the edge of the property. Inside, nestled among the usual assortment of junk mail and utility bills, was a single, thick, official-looking envelope. It was pristine and addressed to the proprietors of the community garden, 1421 Oakwood Drive. The sender was listed as the Oakwood Manor Homeowners Association. A small shiver of unease ran down her spine. The HOA was a notoriously rigid and uncompromising organization, led by a man named Mr. Henderson, who prized order and aesthetics above all else. They had never bothered them before. She tore open the seal, her hands suddenly trembling. The letter inside was not a greeting or a notice. It was a cold, formal decree. It cited Article 7, Section 3, Subsection B of the Assignations bylaws, which governed unapproved and unsanctioned modifications to residential properties that detract from the aesthetic integrity of the community. It went on to state that the garden, in its current state, was a clear violation and was considered an eyesore. The letter demanded its immediate removal and restoration of the plot to its original state within 30 days. If she failed to comply, she would face fines, legal action, and potential removal by a contracted landscaping company at her own expense. The garden was a violation. The life she had built, the food she provided, the community she had fostered, all of it was being declared illegal. Sarah's world, a world of sun-warmed earth and joyful noise, suddenly went cold and silent. She stood in the fading light, the legalistic jargon of the letter a stark contrast to the living, breathing garden behind her, and for the first time since she had planted the first seed, she felt a profound and terrifying sense of dread. What was she going to do? The next morning, the peaceful rhythm of the garden was shattered by an air of frantic urgency. News of the HOA letter spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, whispered from porch to porch, shared in hushed tones over morning coffee. When Sarah arrived at the garden, it was already a scene of somber assembly. The once cheerful space, with its rows of vibrant vegetables, now felt like a stage set for a funeral. Mr. Thompson, his face a mask of worrying, was there, as was Maria, who had brought her children to help weed, only to learn their source of fresh food was in jeopardy. The community, bound by this shared space, rallied around Sarah, their anger a palpable force. "We can't let them do this," Maria said, her voice shaking with quiet fury. "That food saved my family." Sarah, still reeling from the shock, felt a wave of resolve wash over her. This wasn't just her fight. It was everyone's. She called for a meeting at the small community center hall later that evening, a space that was usually reserved for book clubs and bake sales, now destined to become a war room. The meeting was a chaotic mix of raw emotion and furious brainstorming. People yelled out ideas, their voices a cacophony of outrage, petitions, protests, even a sarcastic suggestion to plant a garden on Mr. Henderson's lawn. Sarah, a natural leader, brought a semblance of order to the chaos. "We have to be smart about this," she urged, holding up the letter. "Mr. Henderson and the HOA operate by the book. We have to do the same." Her plan was simple. They would confront the HOA president directly and, if that failed, they would dissect the bylaws to find a weakness. The next morning, armed with a folder full of photographs of the garden and testimonials from food bank recipients, Sarah went to the HOA office. The building was a sterile, soulless place of polished floors and pale green walls, a stark contrast to the life and chaos of the garden. Mr. Henderson, the president, was a man who seemed to have been carved from ice. He was immaculate in a crisp shirt, his tie a perfect knot, his hair a helmet of silver. He sat behind a large, mahogany desk, his posture rigid and formal. He didn't offer Sarah a seat. "Ms. Miller," he began, his voice flat and devoid of warmth, "I have your letter right here. The matter is quite clear. The garden is in violation of the bylaws, specifically Section 7, Subsection 3, which is clearly outlined. It's an unapproved modification that detracts from the property's aesthetic integrity." Sarah pushed the folder across the desk. "Mr. Henderson, this isn't just a modification, it's a community asset. It provides food to over a dozen families, including some of your neighbors." He didn't even glance at the photos. "The bylaws do not make an exception for humanitarian causes, Ms. Miller. Rules are rules. The garden is unsanctioned and it must be removed." He pointed to a small clock on his desk. "My next meeting is in 5 minutes." The meeting was a complete failure. Sarah left the office with her folder, her hope draining away with every step. Mr. Henderson was a wall of indifference, a man who saw the world in black and white, and the garden, to him, was a blot on his perfect canvas. With the confrontation a bitter failure, the community gathered again, this time at Sarah's house. Spread across her living room floor were stacks of paper, legal pads, and a thick, intimidating binder containing the full HOA bylaws. It was a tedious, mind-numbing task. Every paragraph, every sentence, every comma was scrutinized. Old Mr. Thompson, his bifocals perched on the end of his nose, read through clauses on fence heights and paint colors. Maria, her children asleep in the next room, highlighted sections on property lines and common areas. A high school student, tech-savvy and quick, searched online for legal precedents in similar HOA disputes. Hours bled into one another, fueled by a relentless supply of coffee and a shared sense of purpose. The hope, once a bright flame, was now a flickering ember. Every time they thought they had found something, a counterclause would appear, a legalistic trapdoor that closed their path. "There's nothing," Maria sighed in exhaustion, her head in her hands. "It's airtight." Sarah felt the despair, but she refused to let it take hold. "Keep looking," she said, her voice tired but firm. "There has to be something." She herself was poring over Section 5, which governed the use of community-owned property. This was the key. The land the garden sat on was not a residential plot. It was a communal space owned by the HOA. She started to cross-reference every section that mentioned community-owned property. The text was dense and confusing, a web of legal jargon. Then she saw it. Tucked away in a subsection on communal land use, she found a single sentence: "All community-owned land may be designated for public, recreational, or educational purposes with board approval." A tiny, almost insignificant line, but it was there. Educational purposes, she whispered, the words a lifeline. The garden was a place of education. They taught children about farming, hosted workshops on sustainable living, and educated people on healthy eating. It was a flimsy argument, but it was an argument. She immediately called a friend, a lawyer named Mark, who had experience with property law. She read him the line, her voice trembling with excitement. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "It's a long shot, Sarah," he finally said. "The board could argue that a vegetable garden, in a formal educational purpose, they'll say it's just a hobby. But it's a shot. It's a way to fight." The hope in his words was tempered by a sober warning. "They're not going to like this. They'll come at you hard. Be ready for a fight." The call ended, leaving Sarah with a new fire in her belly and a fresh wave of anxiety. She had found a way to fight, but the fight was going to be harder than she could ever have imagined. She looked at the faces of her neighbors, tired but hopeful, and she knew she couldn't let them down. They had a plan, a risky, dangerous plan, and now they had to see it through. With the risky legal loophole now their only weapon, Sarah and the community decided it was time to take their fight public. They realized that against the HOA's cold, legalistic power, their greatest asset was the emotional truth of their story. Sarah created a social media page with the hashtag #SaveOurGarden, a simple but powerful plea that quickly gained traction. People from the neighborhood, and then from the wider city, began sharing photos and videos of the garden, tagging local news outlets and politicians. They posted heart-wrenching stories of how the fresh produce helped single mothers like Maria feed their children, how it brought purpose to retirees like Mr. Thompson, and how it taught their kids the simple magic of watching a seed grow. The digital groundswell was impossible to ignore. A local news reporter, a tenacious young woman named Maya, saw the posts and contacted Sarah. She came to the garden with a small camera crew, capturing the vibrant life of the place and interviewing the community members who spoke with raw emotion and sincerity. The evening news report was a powerful piece of journalism. It showed a stark contrast. On one hand, the bustling, life-affirming garden, filled with happy faces and bountiful harvest. On the other, a detached shot of the sterile HOA office and a chillingly formal voiceover quoting their threat to dismantle a project that fed the hungry. Public opinion, previously unaware of the conflict, was now squarely on the side of the garden. Donations poured in, and offers of legal assistance came from all corners of the city. The community, once feeling defeated, was now riding a wave of hope, their morale soaring. Meanwhile, in his immaculate, perfectly ordered home, Mr. Henderson watched the news report alone. The camera's unflinching focus on the faces of the community members, their earnest pleas, and their tearful testimonials seemed to pierce his carefully constructed wall of indifference. The television screen reflected in the polished surface of a framed photograph on his mantelpiece a picture of a smiling young boy who bore a striking resemblance to a younger Henderson. He didn't see a community in that report. He saw chaos, he saw unpredictability. For him, the garden wasn't a source of food, it was a breach in the order, a festering violation that could lead to something far worse. A flash of memory, a fleeting, painful image, flickered through his mind, the acrid smell of smoke, the sound of sirens, and a frantic search for a missing person, all stemming from a chaotic, unregulated community event years ago that had ended in tragedy. The rigid bylaws, the aesthetic standards, the need for control, they were not about power for him, but about a deep, misguided need to prevent history from repeating itself. He saw himself not as a villain, but as a guardian protecting the neighborhood from the very chaos that Sarah and her followers seemed to embrace. He sat in his chair, the glow of the television illuminating his face, a mask of grim determination. He wouldn't back down, not now, not ever. The community's victory was short-lived. A week after the news report aired, a new letter arrived, not for Sarah, but for the nonprofit food bank that served as the garden's primary distribution partner. The letter, once again cold and legalistic, was from the HOA's lawyers. It accused the food bank of knowingly engaging with an entity in violation of local and community bylaws and warned them that continued partnership would result in a lawsuit for damages to property values and public reputation. It was a devastatingly precise strike. The food bank, a small and fragile organization, couldn't afford a legal battle. Their board, fearing for their own survival, was forced to make a terrible decision. They issued a statement, regrettably cutting all ties with the community garden. Until the dispute was settled, the news hit Sarah and the community like a sucker punch. The joy and hope they had felt from the news coverage evaporated instantly. The HOA had bypassed their legal argument entirely and attacked their mission at its most vulnerable point. The educational purposes loophole no longer mattered if they had no one to give their harvest to. The phone calls from supporters stopped coming in, the donations slowed to a trickle. The community, which had been so united and full of fight, now looked at each other with fear and confusion. Mr. Henderson's retaliation was not a public argument, but a quiet, surgical strike that left them crippled. They were left with a garden full of produce and nowhere for it to go. They had fought so hard, and now, standing in the middle of their beautiful, bountiful garden, it felt as though all was lost. With the food bank now severed as their lifeline, the community garden became a beautiful, silent monument to a lost cause. The vibrant rows of tomatoes and zucchini, once a source of pride and purpose, now felt like a cruel reminder of their failure. People stopped coming to tend to the plots, their shoulders slumped in defeat. The air of celebration had been replaced by a heavy, palpable stillness. Sarah, the fire in her eyes now a weary flicker, found herself sitting alone on an old wooden bench, staring at the overgrown weeds that were beginning to reclaim the edges of the garden. She felt a profound sense of failure, not just for herself, but for Maria, for Mr. Thompson, and for every family that had relied on the garden. They had fought hard, but Mr. Henderson's ruthless, calculated retaliation had left them with no way forward. It was in this moment of utter despair that she was approached by an older woman she didn't recognize. The woman was small and elegant, with a kind face etched with the lines of age and a pair of eyes that held a sharp, knowing glint. "You must be Sarah," the woman said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm Eleanor. I used to live on this street for 40 years, and I was on the HOA board with Mr. Henderson for 10 of them." Sarah looked up, a glimmer of curiosity cutting through her despondency. Eleanor sat down beside her, her gaze sweeping over the silent garden. "I've been watching what he's done," she continued. "He's a good man, Sarah, but he's not what you think he is. You're fighting a set of bylaws, but he's fighting a memory. Eleanor then began to tell a story that explained everything. Years ago, before the garden, before the pristine lawns and the strict rules, there had been a different community gathering an annual street fair that had been a chaotic, beloved tradition. Mr. Henderson's son, a boy named David, had been in the thick of it, running around and playing. In the midst of the uncontrolled chaos of the fair, a poorly secured carnival tent had collapsed. David, in the wrong place at the wrong time, had been badly injured. The incident had haunted Mr. Henderson. He hadn't just lost a son to an accident. He had lost him to the very chaos he now fought so hard to control. The bylaws, the strict rules, the demand for order, they weren't about property values or aesthetics for him. They were a shield he had built to protect the community from the kind of tragedy that had befallen his own family. He's not a monster, Sarah, Eleanor finished, her voice full of empathy. He's a grieving father who believes that if he can control every single detail, he can prevent another child from getting hurt. The revelation was a stunning, seismic shift in perspective. Sarah's anger and frustration with Mr. Henderson evaporated, replaced by a profound sense of pity and understanding. He wasn't a villain, he was a broken man hiding behind a wall of rules. The community's previous strategy of fighting with legal loopholes and public outrage was no longer relevant. They couldn't fight his rules, they had to break through his emotional barrier. This wasn't a legal battle anymore, it was a personal one. Eleanor's information wasn't a legal trump card, it was a human key to his heart. The new hope didn't come from a document, but from a deeper understanding of their opponent. Sarah immediately called the community together again, her voice filled with a newfound urgency and resolve. She explained Eleanor's story, and the stunned faces of her neighbors slowly began to change. Mr. Thompson's anger faded to sorrow, and Maria's tears were no longer of frustration, but of empathy. They finally understood, with this new knowledge, their purpose was redefined. They weren't just fighting for their garden. They were fighting to heal their community, to reach out to a man who had built a prison of order around himself. They decided to call for a final, public meeting with the HOA board, a meeting they would not spend debating bylaws, but sharing their stories. This meeting would not be about winning, it would be about reaching out and showing Mr. Henderson that their garden wasn't chaos, but a force for good. The final days were a flurry of preparation. They meticulously planned their speeches, not as arguments, but as personal appeals. They were going to tell their stories, not as a defiant act, but as an olive branch. They were going to show him, in a way he could not ignore, that his obsession with control was preventing the very community connection that could help heal his pain. As the day of the meeting loomed, the community garden, once silent, began to stir with renewed life. They weeded the beds and watered the plants with a sense of purpose, not just to save their garden, but to prepare for the final, most important act, to tell their story, and perhaps to finally bring Mr. Henderson home. The final HOA meeting was not held in the sterile office, but in the larger community hall, a choice that seemed to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. The room was packed. Neighbors who had never before attended an HOA meeting filled every seat and lined the walls. The air was thick with a mixture of hope, tension, and silent expectation. At the front of the room, behind a long table, sat the HOA board, with Mr. Henderson positioned in the center. He looked like a man preparing for a siege, his face a hard mask of indifference. He called the meeting to order with a rap of his gavel, his eyes scanning the crowd with a cold, unwavering stare. "We are here to vote on the motion to uphold the bylaw violation against the community garden," he announced, his voice echoing in the silent hall. He then opened the floor for comments, but with a strict 5-minute limit per speaker. The community, led by Sarah, had a different plan. The first to speak was Maria, her voice trembling slightly but full of conviction. She didn't talk about bylaws or loopholes. She spoke about her children, about the first fresh vegetables they had ever seen, and the simple joy of cooking a healthy meal with food that didn't come from a can. She wasn't there to fight. She was there to share her truth. The next speaker was Mr. Thompson, his old, shaky voice recounting how the garden had given him a new purpose after his retirement. He spoke of the camaraderie, the conversations, and the feeling of belonging that had replaced the loneliness of his days. One by one, the neighbors stood up, not to argue, but to tell their stories. Each story was a small, quiet chip at the armor of rules and regulations Mr. Henderson had built around himself. Then it was Sarah's turn. She walked to the front of the room, not with the defiant fire she had held a week ago, but with a profound sense of calm and empathy. She looked directly at Mr. Henderson, bypassing the other board members entirely. The room fell into a hush so complete that you could hear the soft whir of the air conditioning. Mr. Henderson, she began, her voice steady and clear. I'm not here to debate bylaws, we've all read them, and we know your position. I'm here to talk about something else, about community, about loss. She then told the story of his son, David, of the tragedy that had shaped him. She spoke of the street fair, the chaos, and the terrible accident that had left him with the need to control everything around him to prevent any possibility of a similar event from ever happening again. You see this garden as chaos, Mr. Henderson, she said, her voice filled with a gentle power. You see it as an unapproved modification that could lead to something bad, but we see it as something else. This isn't chaos, it's life, it's hope. We lost a piece of our community when the food bank had to turn us away, and I know you know what that feels like, the grief, the emptiness. This garden isn't just about vegetables, it's about healing. It's about people coming together to support each other. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She simply laid out the emotional truth of the situation. Mr. Henderson sat motionless, but his face had lost its hardness. The mask had cracked, and for the first time, the room saw a flash of the pain and sorrow that had been hidden for so long. His eyes, which had been cold and hard, now held a deep, watery sadness. After Sarah's speech, there was a long, heavy silence. The other board members looked at Mr. Henderson, unsure of what to do. He slowly stood up, his gaze never leaving Sarah's. He didn't reach for his gavel. He took a deep breath, and his voice, when he spoke, was not the cold, formal one they were used to, but a fragile, trembling sound of a man who had finally let his guard down. You're right, Ms. Miller, he said, his eyes welling up with tears that finally fell, tracing paths down his stoic face. I have been fighting a memory. I've spent 20 years trying to control every possible outcome to prevent another tragedy. I've forgotten what it means to be part of a community, to trust in something other than rules. He looked out at the room, at the faces of his neighbors, no longer strangers, but people he had deeply wronged. He spoke of his son, David, for the first time in years, sharing the story of his accident and the grief that had consumed him. He apologized for his actions, for his indifference, and for the pain he had caused. He then looked at the other board members. I move that we withdraw the bylaw violation, he announced. The vote was unanimous. The room erupted in a collective cheer, a wave of relief and joy that washed over everyone. The community, once on the brink of defeat, had won. The celebration was not a riotous party, but a quiet, heartwarming gathering back at the garden. The following morning, the beds were already being tended to, but this time with a new sense of purpose and togetherness, and in the middle of it all was Mr. Henderson. He stood awkwardly at first, a man of rules and order surrounded by the beautiful chaos of growing things. Sarah walked over to him, holding out a trowel. You know, she said, a kind smile on her face, this garden could really use a structural plan, maybe a more efficient watering system. He took the trowel from her, a hesitant smile breaking through his serious expression. I think I can help with that, he said. The news of the garden's victory spread, and soon, the food bank was back on board, thrilled to be a part of the community's triumph. The final scene was a simple one. A large truck from the food bank arriving at the garden, not to cut ties, but to load up a massive haul of fresh, vibrant vegetables. Mr. Henderson, with dirt now on his pristine hands, stood beside Sarah, watching. With a quiet satisfaction, the garden was saved, not by illegal loopholes or defiant protests, but by a community that had learned to fight with empathy, proving that the strongest foundation for any neighborhood is not in its rules, but in the heart of its people.